As we walked into the capital of Cryterian, Cryphon'slibrary, I found it amusing that even all that happened to this place, I could still see this city's and the greater nation's annellar roots. A bit of architecture here, a line and curve of the roads there, minor things. But to the practiced, or ancient eye, the genesis of this land was clear. "It's a wonder, even to you, isn't it?" Percival spoke as we walked along the road. This was not a place that existed in the old age, yet it clearly finds its origins there. So, it is curious. I haven't spent the time to delve too deeply into its history. There has been so very much to catch up on. So many new things. An unstated question went unasked by my companion, thankfully. There is both a lot to learn and not much at all. They've kept to themselves for the most part, but have had a mostly unseen yet undeniable effect on the history of the realms. And, except for a couple large incidents, they've managed to keep themselves out of the limelight. Not bad for what was originally intended as a planetary conquest force. He was waiting for my reaction, and smiled as I turned, looking in shock. Conquest? How could that be? It was Kurt the Skychild, one of the heroes of the Vanquishers, that founded all of this, right? He nodded, the smile on his face widening. How by her throne does that happen? I mean, why would he want to? He's never struck me as the type. He's a loyal man. He's a soldier, He's definitely not a madman. It didn't make sense. He was just that. A madman. At least he was at the time. He stopped abruptly, smiling wide. "Ah! It is still here and open." I followed his gaze to an old tavern. "A wonderful place where we can grab a drink and a meal. I'll explain a bit more as we eat. Thirsty work, you know." Smiling at my growing confusion, Percival led the way, chuckling as we walked towards the tavern. By the 9 and 4, welcome once more to the library. In today's entry we'll be learning a bit more about the history of the nation of the Crystons, that being Cryterian. Unlike most of our entries, this accounting will come foremost with our tale, with the occasional explanation or clarification on my behalf. So, I do hope you enjoy this brief history of Cryterian. We entered the tavern and I saw Percival wave to the barkeep in an odd manner. Some sort of sign, obviously, and the barkeep just nodded towards the door in the back, to which Percival made his way, calling for his stash and large portions of the stew and roast that filled the air of this rustic establishment with its delightful aroma to be brought to us. Past the door indicated and down the lift that it had concealed, we found ourselves in a nice, if cozy, private room. A large table and a window for receiving food and drink from above, with the entire affair sealed quite impressively from outside observation, while not being blatant in its obfuscation of this room. Don't forget, Bird Brain, Cryterian was originally an annellar battle city, Percival said as he retrieved bottles of liquor and the pot of stew, looking at the tray of the roast as I walked up and grabbed it, along with the bowls and other pieces of fine-smelling meal that had been sent down, breads and butters. A bastion city, actually, I corrected, and Percival looked at me with a mix of surprise and amusement. Ah, you would be one of the few to even know the difference, you old fart. You are correct, of course. To this day, no one quite knows where he got it. Common theories is that he found it somewhere in the many years before he took part in the Vanquisher's rise, along with finding the reconciled and recovered, and he just kept it in his back pocket until the time was right. That would make sense knowing Carthus. He was pragmatic, and this would have been a very ambitious project. Timing would have been key. Carthus Skychild was born many millennia before the events of the Vanquisher's rise, and had been a Christon for the great majority of that time. So, it is indeed very likely that it was during this time that he found the city that he created Cryterian from, perhaps along with the vast amount of Christon bodies that had never been activated in the old age, that would become known as the Recovered. The Reconciled, on the other hand, were those surviving Christons that had managed to live all the years from the beginning of the Age of Vanson and the fall of the NLR to this point in history. They were recruited by Carthus to be among the first citizens of Cryterian. Each of them was allowed to take a new name and a new life, free from any past they may have had, yet each bringing the wisdom of the ages that they had lived to their new home and nation. Either way, after the Vanquishers rose and beat the pants off the demon, and among the wild amount of things happening in those very chaotic centuries, Carthus chose to play his hand. He introduced Cryterian to the world, and it was fairly well accepted. He had married Rinley at this point, and they'd even had kids, Verisar and Fierstein. Percival took a large bite of roast, followed by a long drink, pausing to wipe his chin. Of course, then came the judges, Krovax, the Lost Centuries, the outbreak of the Shadowmere conflict. That culminated in the Battle of the Link, and then there was the enduring war. Wait, Battle of the Link? Shadowmere conflict? I mean, I've heard of the judges and that of Krovax, who was bested by Carthus's children, correct? And the Lost Century. How much of this place history is off of the books? I knew there had been much for me to cover in the many long ages of my absence. All those years I had been confined and away from the greater realm. But I had looked up a general history. Multiple of them, in fact. And I've never heard of half of these things. Percival looked at me intently for a few moments, considering his words. He seemed surprised and somewhat off foot. Some of it might be above your need to know, and I don't want to get into trouble with this. He softly smiled, as if that would make things any better. So, I'll just cover what's relevant to our point. Many of the things I just mentioned were the consequence of managerial misconduct. It could be said to start with the madness that Carthus himself was afflicted with, the madness I spoke of earlier. When he formed this city, he formed it as a place for Christons to be safe, and the madness took it for them to also be a place for them to rule from. He was building and planning for full conquest of Jamamar, to protect it. If I've got my years right, from what I gather, only the home city and Avlin would have been able to stand a chance against. What stopped him? As will be explained in a future entry, after the reign of Vanson and soon after this particular point in Realm's history, the founding of Cryterian, the secrets of Christek were still lost to the majority of the world. Other than the original machine gifts of the NLR that brought basic comfort, the knowledge of Christek, especially any of weaponized nature, was all but absent from Jamamar. Thus, a flying city full of Crystons, and a military focused around such high technologies would have been nearly uncontestable for the people of the realms. What stopped him? Of all things? Love. Or, more precisely, being found out by his wife, and subsequently snapped out of his madness via percussive corrective affection. What is that? In short, she beat his ass. Like any good wife will do when her husband goes off the deep end and brings shame to the family. Or threatens to. He laughed as he ate more of the stew. That, and having kids seemed to have brought him back to himself. But things were afoot, and the bodies he had built for his children, the Cryston bodies they would be transferred into, were sabotaged, and they ended up becoming inflicted of madness of their own. You keep mentioning a madness. Where does this stem from? There are theories. There are always theories. The most prominent of them says that being of the bloodline of the goddess of madness brought madness to all of her line, but never really bought into that idea. Why? It would make sense, wouldn't it? He looked at me with a bored yet questioning gaze. Because Her Majesty is not a goddess that suffers from all forms of madness. Don't get me wrong, she has felt the touch of each form of madness that existed, subsumed herself in their embrace, and then proceeded to master, control, and contain them. She is the goddess of madness, yes. She is the goddess of mastering all madness, as is her line. So, barring blood curses, what's the other options? What do you think it is, Perce? My guess? Interference. Upper management, perhaps? Doesn't really matter now, does it? It happened. And by the end of things, Carthus had been censured, Cryterian became this continent, the base city exploded and expanded out, with all the space in between being filled with the essence of Carthus, as his punishment was to try and hold his beloved nation together by becoming the continent. His children, and their friends including the elven noblest Gabriella, had defeated Korvax, the Shalmir conflict which saw a twisted version of Cryterian be created, but at 9 times the size and numbers, and with a leader crafted to be 9 times what Carthus was in all ways, had ended, and the enduring war was in full swing. Well, wait, what did you say happened? Where do you craft a force like that? And where did the materials even come from for that? It took Carthus centuries. It had to have. Again, it's complicated. But I will say this. This force was meant to fully and singularly be geared and focused to the conquest of Cryterian, its destruction, and then the same for the rest of Jamamar. However, this force's central control, command structure, and logistical chain was slaughtered, or otherwise neutralized during the Battle of the Link. Now, there are scores of reserve stations that were in interplanar space, all set to support the larger offensive. Without a leader, they just splinter off, create new stations, and continue in a guerrilla war fashion. They are fully programmed in all the tactics necessary and to engage this war and the strategies to attempt to do it competently. And that is what the Enduring War is? Yes. The Cryterian House Advanced Division was created and tasked with the prosecution of the Enduring War. It's the longest war Jamamar will never know about. led by the War Master Verisar himself and his personal unit, the Brutes. While Verisar Skychild and his Brutes are known as heroes in both Cryterian and the Greater Realms, having made several appearances in the Grand Colosseum at Polaron for various events, they are just known as members of the Special Forces of Cryterian, not as the spear tip of the House Advanced Division. In fact, to most, the only advanced division within Cryterian is that of the Cryterian Military Advanced Division. The House Advanced Division is not a public entity, and most of the members that serve within it merely pass themselves as members of the normal military. So, after all this land is as we see now, one thing I never understood, even being here, is where are all the factories? The shipyards? Percival had that grin again. I continued. Cryterian sells more star vessels, weapons, than any other nation, and yet I haven't seen a single facility, a few workshops, that's it. I mean, how do they even wage a... Oh. Percival's grin became laughter as I realized the answer. You got a quick tag. Not quick enough, but quick. Yes, all those stations they have taken over the many millennia. Each has been converted into manufacturing and production facilities for Cryterian. That is the secret behind their economic might. But, since they always cede ground if another one enters a market they are dominating, no one's ever looked into it too closely. However, most of the big shots do know about it, in some fashion or another. And since Cryterian does not monopolize things, or lord over the other realms with this, everybody stays happy. The various stations and assets that are seized during this eternal war are dedicated to the production of goods of other nations and groups as well, going so far as to see entire facilities sold to those with deep enough pockets and the trust of both the Omnimind and King Skychild. So, they have a few tumultuous centuries in the beginning, as the rest of the world was having at that time. They end up with this endless war, but the endless spoils thereof, and they just decided to stay out of the limelight until the Skytear incident, right? For the most part. They even had a regency for a few millennia. Karthus and Renly and the family backed away from direct rulership, but that was reverted under strong advisement. Ended up with Calcin on the throne. Freyon and Fierstein spawned that one. Now, to his credit, he has led very well and done right by his people. I even heard he tried to pay big and tough on the Empress once. Now that made me chuckle. One does not try to intimidate Her Majesty, even if you are one of her line and immune to the worst of her displeasures. So, when the Age of Stars began with the Skytear incident, that great force that was lost was really only a fraction of what Cryterian had available? The Skytear incident marks the beginning of the actual Age of Stars in many historians' view. To cover in brief, the Cryterian fleet was breaking from Jamamar's orbit to begin claiming the rest of the local system for the realms. They were intercepted and stopped by the appearance of another fleet, smaller yet very significant in numbers, and in direct opposition to them. This second fleet is still a mystery to all on its origins and alignment, as well as the reason for their appearance and their hostility. However, what is known is that during the first maneuvers of the action, a rift in reality was somehow created across both fleets. This rift ripped open and tore in the totality of both of these fleets very violently, before closing again as quickly as it had appeared. Neither fleet nor any personnel were ever seen or heard from again. Presumed lost to inter-reality space, beyond the reach of even the gods. This loss of personnel crippled exploration in the initial years of the Age of Stars, as Cryterian was by far the largest provider of specialists needed for this, as well as the vessels that would be crewed by them. Kinda. If you don't count the House Advance Division, which was, as always, engaged in the Enduring War. Around 80% of the rest of all Cryterian military personnel were lost in the Sky Tear. They did have a massive stockpile of ships and other material in reserve, but almost no one left to man or use them. If it were not from the shock and the peace that occurred in the years after the incident, the first few centuries of the Age of Stars being calm and building up for what was to come, Cryterian would have been destroyed. They were on the edge. Although, to be fair, it was a very well kept secret. Most of the realms just thought the ageless Crystons were in mourning and seclusion after the incident. None knew the degree that they were actually laid low by it. So how did they recover from that? I mean, the amount of everything that is represented just by so many Crystons is insane. How do you come back from that kind of loss? Luck, for one. Shortly thereafter, a couple more centuries or so, the Revered were discovered. Their detention center, exactly. And Cryterian received quite the donation from the attached vaults before the whole place went up in flames after busting out the Revered. The Revered are a council of Dragon and Analar firsts that are joined together to further the mastery of the gifts given to them and to understand the reality that they were brought into by the Nine Wings. As such cooperation was a threat to the warring factions and their goals during the early years of the Wars of Feather and Scale, and the power that they were beginning to research threatened both sides. They contained and locked away the Revered, along with several other primal things during what was known as the Great Work. The Great Work occurred between the First and Second War of Feather and Scale. Once they were rediscovered by members of the realm and freed, they soon faded from any limelight while remaining approachable with those with the will and the reason to seek them out. More on the Revered will come in the future. Oh, that would have had quite the stockpile of Anis, and that will always be the bottleneck for the Crystons. Without Anis for their minds and their souls, you can't make a proper Cryston. This was most likely an intentional bottleneck, I thought, but I left it unsaid. Exactly, and if I heard right, your aunt helped out with securing that donation. I ignored the comment and the jab. My family was a complicated thing, and soon after that, my own confinement locale was found and I was similarly freed. Yeah, that sounds about right. And for history, a rough history that is, that about covers things up to where you join back into things. You're forgetting about the Omnimine. Where does it fit into all this? Ah, of course. That is perhaps the greatest work of artifice Carthus ever built. It was a base component of the city and now the nation. It was formed from a mesh of all the minds that have ever given themselves a copy of their memories to the Omnimine. But what makes it so strong is what the base of its great mind is. He got help from most of the V's. And all the years of Cryterian's history since it was created, it has never acted in any way that has brought shame to the nation or the realms. It serves as a central information exchange and advisory probability planner and reference for the various leaders of the towns and villages across Cryterian. It now also controls the form of the continent and its course now that Carthus was released from his censure and punishment. The Omnimind acts as a voting member at all levels of civic governance, most typically only as a tiebreaker in cases that it is needed. Otherwise, it acts as an advisory and mostly bureaucratic role to the various leaders of the towns and hamlets across the lands of Cryterian. So, what I am getting from all this is, even after all that loss, they are just as strong as ever as a nation, if lacking in the potential numbers they could have. They still manage to provide the realms with a large part of their starships and weapons, as well as almost the best in Christech in the realms. Percival nodded while taking a drink and going in at his stew again. With all that said, how are we supposed to get into the Omnimind chamber? It's got to be secured with nearly every trick in the book. We aren't. You are. He made a great show of reaching into his pocket and pulling out his timepiece, before looking at me. In 3 hours, 34 minutes, and 23 seconds, a series of doors, vents, and other passages will open, creating an opening all the way from the Omnimind's chamber to the castle grounds. This will be open for 3/100ths of a second as the system cycles, and for 3/100ths of a second more 9 minutes later as it finishes its cross cycle. That's not too little time for you to do what you need to do now, is it? His face had that look again, like he was trying to goad something out of me. He wasn't going to get it though. 3/100ths of a second. And with our tale coming to a close, I hope you've enjoyed this history of Cryterian, as told by one who saw much of it with his own crystalline eyes. Before we finish, as always, I'd like to thank you for your time and your attention. As always, it means the world. And until you next visit the library, by the 9 and 4, be well, take care of yourselves, and each other. That should be more than enough. Pass me a bottle. You got this, right? This will be thirsty work. It would be a lot closer than I was hoping for, but under the circumstances, I'd take it. The cost was far too high not to do this. As I ate my stew and I thought about all Percival had told me, I couldn't quite shake the feeling I had been missing something. Up to 9 minutes in the chamber. What should I be looking out for security-wise? Oh, nothing automatic. The Omnimind frankly doesn't need it. And it can protect itself with any number of weapons or other systems that are in the chamber manually. Well, manually. I assume you're not going there with violence in mind, so I'll wager you'll just end up having a nice chat. Or being expelled out with all due force and alarms raised. Yeah, there's a chance it might just choose to end you without taking the risk. I glanced up from my bowl of stew at that one, only to see he wasn't joking. There was no jest or mirth in his eyes. He's being completely serious. No, I'm not going for violence. I just need to retrieve something. Well, you best hope that the Omnimind doesn't care that you take it. Indeed, you better hope it wants you to have it. If not, I'll have 9 minutes to convince it. We all know how charming I am. I smiled warmly. He did not match my expression. You are on your own once you get in. I'll be busy with other things until you get out. Don't take the Omnimind lightly. It's far more than powerful enough to put you down and keep you down. no matter how much of a badass you actually are.